the desert planet. Theron 4 was not made for life, not even for the stubborn kind that had evolved under harsher suns. The sky was a pale white blur, the air thick with shimmering distortion, and the ground rippled with heat so intense that it seemed alive. Every grain of sand carried the burn of a forge. When the shuttle door opened and the first wave of heat struck the cadets' faces, even the reptilian species hissed in discomfort. The Galactic Academy's survival exam was famous for testing endurance, ingenuity, and cooperation across species, but this assignment seemed almost cruel. There was no shade for miles, no rock formations, no sign of vegetation, only an endless plain of golden sand stretching beyond the horizon. Each cadet had been issued a week's supply of rations and a basic toolkit. The rules were simple: survive 7 full cycles using whatever resources the planet provided. No contact, no rescue until the final extraction. The Academy instructors watched from orbit, monitoring vitals and environmental data, but they would not intervene. As soon as the transport lifted off, the silence became unbearable. The faint hum of the ship's engines faded, leaving only the sound of the wind scraping against the dunes like sandpaper on metal. Aaron Holt, the only human in the group, stood slightly apart from the others. His dark hair clung to his forehead, already damp with sweat. He squinted toward the horizon, his eyes narrowing against the blinding reflection of the sun. Around him, the other cadets, avian, reptilian, insectoid, mammalian, were already arguing in sharp tones about where to set up camp. Most of them came from species used to climates that would kill a human in minutes, but even they were trembling under this heat. The planet's surface temperature had already climbed past 70 degrees Celsius. It was not a test of strength. It was a test of who could stay conscious long enough to think. Within hours, the first makeshift shelters rose, a patchwork of reflective panels, fabric sheets, and survival pods half buried in sand. The avian cadets, covered in pale feathers, dug shallow depressions and crawled inside, trying to use the Earth's thin crust as insulation. The reptilians burrowed deeper, relying on their natural resistance to heat. The insectoids spun resinous shells around themselves that hardened like amber under the sun. Everyone had a method, everyone had a plan, and yet every plan ended with the same desperate goal: escape the air itself. Aaron joined none of the groups. He tested the sand with his gloved hand, feeling how it shifted beneath the surface. It was too dry to hold shape, too loose to form walls. He looked toward the horizon again and saw mirages trembling like pools of water that vanished when he blinked. His body ached already. The heat clawed at his lungs with every breath, and his clothes clung to his skin, soaked with sweat that evaporated before it could cool him. He drank from his canteen carefully, counting the mouthfuls, and then crouched beside his gear. While others used their shovels to dig pits for rest, he started to assemble his toolkit, laying out the metal rods and heat sensors one by one, memorizing what he had. By the second hour, the cries began. The mammalian cadets, creatures covered in thick fur, collapsed in the sand, their bodies unable to release heat fast enough. Their leaders shouted for help, dragging them toward shaded pits. The avians began shedding feathers, plucking them out in clumps, their bodies trembling from stress. The reptilians hissed that the humans would never last the night, but even they were growing sluggish. Aaron said nothing. He watched and learned. He saw how quickly the top layer of sand cooled when the wind shifted. He noticed how the dunes cast thin shadows that moved with the angle of the sun. He listened to the faint sound beneath the surface, a hollow vibration that told him there was porous rock not far below. By dusk, the temperature dropped slightly, but the air still shimmered. The horizon turned deep red, then violet, as the sun dipped below the dunes. The alien cadets crawled into their holes, hoping the night would bring relief. Aaron remained outside, staring at the sky. The stars here looked closer, distorted by the heat haze. He felt small, but awake, the fatigue sharpening his mind instead of dulling it. He began to draw in the sand with a stick, rough lines, sketches of airflow, notes on direction. He had studied environmental systems back on Earth, trained to understand how deserts could hide life beneath their deathly calm. There was always a layer, a threshold, where the air cooled and moisture collected. He just had to find it. When the first night wind arrived, it was like opening an oven door. The temperature barely dropped. The air was filled with static, tiny sparks of light dancing over the dunes. Some of the cadets moaned in their sleep, dreaming of water. Aaron knelt beside his pit, dug only knee-deep, and placed his palm flat on the bottom. The sand was hot on the surface but cooler below. He smiled faintly, a small victory. He spent the rest of the night mapping temperature changes at different depths, using one of his instruments to record data every few meters. It was a tedious process, but he didn't stop. He worked in silence, guided by logic and instinct, his movements deliberate and patient. By the time the first pale light crept over the horizon, he had dug 6 narrow test holes in a pattern across the plain. His muscles trembled from exhaustion, but the results confirmed what he suspected. Beneath the top layer of scorched sand was a porous bed of mineral rock that retained moisture from deep atmospheric condensation. It wasn't much, but it meant potential for storage, insulation, even filtration. He stared at the small screen of his scanner, watching the temperature readings drop sharply at certain depths. Below the worst of the heat, there was safety. He looked around at the others. The avian cadets were huddled together, panting softly. Their feathers were brittle and broken. The reptilians had dug deeper, forming burrows that were beginning to collapse inward. The insectoids were trapped inside their hardened shells, some motionless. Aaron felt no pride, only urgency. The Academy had designed this exam to push them to their limits, but the others were already breaking. He knew that hiding underground in shallow pits would only delay the inevitable. Heat would seep down, suffocating them slowly. To truly survive, they needed more than a hole. They needed a system. When the second day's sun rose, it burned brighter, crueler. The dunes glowed white. Even the air shimmered with visible waves of light. Aaron wrapped a cloth around his face, grabbed his pack, and began walking. He needed to find a depression deep enough to begin something larger. Each step sank into the sand like walking on coals. His boots grew hot enough to smoke, but he kept moving until he reached a low ridge where the dunes met a cracked plateau of dark stone. There, he knelt and brushed the sand aside, revealing the texture of the rock, porous, light, and dry, but cooler than the surface. Perfect. He unpacked his tools, using his shovel to test the rock's brittleness. It fractured easily under pressure. That was his foundation. He marked the spot with a flag and started planning his structure. He wasn't just thinking of himself now. He was thinking of the others, of how to channel airflow, how to make something that could protect them all. It would take days, maybe longer, but he had time. The exam wasn't about who suffered least. It was about who adapted fastest. As the heat grew unbearable, he sat in the shadow of a dune, sketching designs on a strip of metal with a sharp stone. His plan looked nothing like the others' survival holes. He imagined vertical shafts to capture the wind, horizontal tunnels to guide the air through wet stone, and central chambers with condensation pools. He didn't want to hide from the desert. He wanted to transform it. He wanted to make comfort where none should exist. When the evening fell again, he returned to camp. Most of the cadets were too weak to move, their skin cracked and peeling, their eyes sunken. One avian female raised her head and asked hoarsely if he had found water. Aaron simply said, "Not yet, but I found something better." Then he looked toward the ridge glowing faintly under the twin moons, where his future shelter would soon take shape. The night wind passed over the dunes with a low hiss, as if the planet itself whispered in approval. For the first time since landing, Aaron felt not like a victim of the heat, but its equal. He understood that survival wasn't about hiding from the elements. It was about learning to speak their language. By the third dawn on Theron 4, the horizon shimmered like liquid fire. The temperature climbed faster than the day before, and the faint breeze that once moved the dunes had turned into still, suffocating air. The alien cadets had stopped arguing. Silence had replaced panic. The only sounds were the soft groans of those who tried to dig deeper into their pits, the scraping of shovels against burning sand, and the faint hum of equipment that barely functioned under the heat. Most had given up on constructing shelters and now focused only on surviving another hour. Aaron Holt rose from the shadow of a half-buried ridge, his face hidden under a scarf soaked in his last reserve of water. His limbs ached, his throat was raw, and the skin beneath his gloves had started to blister, but his mind burned brighter than the sun above. He had already mapped the plateau's structure and collected enough mineral fragments to confirm what he had hoped for. Beneath the dunes, under layers of porous rock, there existed a natural trap for moisture condensed from the air's microscopic vapor. He didn't need an oasis or a hidden spring. He needed to control the planet's breath. He began walking toward the plateau again, his boots sinking into the scorching sand. Every step felt heavier, the heat pressing down on his spine like a physical weight. By now, several cadets had noticed his absence during the previous night and whispered that the human had lost his mind. They saw no logic in leaving the group's shallow shelters to wander into the open. But Aaron didn't hear them. His thoughts were consumed by patterns, the flow of heat, the rhythm of wind, and the subtle way the planet exhaled at night. When he reached his marked site, the ridge was almost glowing. He crouched beside the cracks he had made earlier and ran his hand along the surface. The rock was dry, but cool to the touch beneath the top layer. That difference meant life. He set his small solar pick to oscillate at low frequency and began widening the fracture, chipping away until the ground gave in with a soft thud. A hollow space revealed itself beneath the crust, a pocket no larger than his arm's length, but large enough to confirm that the terrain could hold cavities. That was his proof. He spent the next hours testing the area with a small seismograph, planting rods into the ground to detect density variations. The readings showed alternating layers of sand and stone, dense enough to form a dome if excavated carefully. It was exactly what he needed. He started outlining the structure in his mind, a circular chamber deep enough to stay below the heat zone, with narrow air shafts angled to capture wind from the eastern ridge. The trick would be to use the difference in temperature between surface and underground to create natural airflow, hot air rising through one shaft, pulling cooler air through another. The system would breathe, just like the planet. As he worked, his vision blurred. The sun reflected on the sand like a sea of molten glass. His hands shook from dehydration, but he kept carving the design into the ground with a metal rod, marking the spots for tunnels and vents. The plan was audacious, maybe impossible to complete with the limited tools he had, but impossible was a human specialty. The others might survive the exam by enduring, but he intended to master it. When the sun finally sank behind the dunes, the sky turned into a dull violet haze. Aaron collapsed into the sand for a moment, catching his breath. The world was still hot, but the first hint of night wind whispered through the ridge, carrying with it a faint, cool undertone. He smiled weakly. That wind would feed his system one day. He gathered his gear and began to dig where the rock was weakest, alternating between pickaxe and hands when the metal became too hot to hold. He removed slabs carefully, setting them aside to form a perimeter. Beneath each layer, the air grew slightly cooler, and a faint scent of minerals filled the space. By midnight, the first part of his excavation resembled a shallow bowl carved into the stone, large enough for him to kneel inside. He checked his readings again and saw a faint spike in humidity. Somewhere below, the porous rock was catching condensation, as he had predicted. He whispered to himself, "Perfect," and resumed digging until exhaustion forced him to stop. At dawn, the others discovered his absence again. A reptilian cadet named Varric approached the ridge, drawn by curiosity or perhaps desperation. His scaled body shimmered under the sunlight as he hissed Aaron's name. When he found the human crouched in the pit, covered in dust and sweat, he stared in disbelief. "You're building a tomb for yourself?" he asked mockingly. Aaron didn't look up. He simply said, "No. I'm building something that will outlast this planet's heat." The reptilian snorted and left, shaking his head. By the fourth cycle, the alien camps looked like graveyards of collapsed pits. The cadets' shelters had turned into ovens. One of the avians died during the night, suffocated by the trapped heat beneath the sand. The Academy's orbital scanners logged it silently, but no rescue came. The surviving cadets whispered about the humans' madness again, but this time a few of them began watching the ridge. Aaron's sight looked different. The sand around it had stopped shifting, the air above it shimmered less, and sometimes when the wind passed, a cool draft escaped the cracks. Inside the pit, Aaron had reinforced the walls with layers of fused sand and mineral fragments, melting them with concentrated sunlight from his reflective sheets. The result was a glass-like surface strong enough to hold shape. He used his toolkit's last thermal pipe to create a channel between the two deepest holes, connecting them into a primitive air exchange system. The difference in pressure already made the air circulate faintly, like a slow breath. He realized the structure was alive in its own way. Each night, he tested his prototype. He left a heat sensor near the bottom and recorded temperature drops of nearly 15 degrees compared to the surface. The data confirmed what he had hoped. His underground design could become a haven, but to transform it into a self-sustaining chamber, he needed more than air movement. He needed moisture. He remembered the condensation that formed on metal canisters during the coldest hour before dawn. If he could trap that vapor, he could cool the space further and create a source of water. He scavenged from abandoned camps, metal fragments, broken energy packs, and even pieces of alien armor to build crude condensers. He lined the inner walls with thin metal sheets, angled to drip moisture into a small hollow. The process was slow but steady. Every morning, a few drops gathered at the bottom. He didn't drink them yet. He watched and learned. The system was working. The planet itself was helping him now. The days blurred together in cycles of blazing sun and restless nights. Aaron worked without speaking to anyone. His movements became mechanical, precise, guided by instinct and discipline. Each evening he expanded the chamber, carving steps downward, shaping alcoves that would one day hold pools and vents. He could already imagine what the final structure would feel like. A place where heat transformed into steam and cold condensed into water, where the oppressive desert would feed a balanced environment. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was creation. On the fifth night, as the wind changed direction, a small miracle occurred. The airflow through his upper vent grew strong enough to create a constant current, pulling warm air out and drawing cooler air in. The temperature inside his chamber dropped sharply. When he entered to check the walls, he found the stone glistening with thin veins of moisture. He wiped it with his fingertips and smiled. The desert had begun to breathe through his design, but triumph brought danger. The same night, 2 insectoid cadets stumbled upon his structure. They followed the cool air, curious and desperate. When they peered into the chamber and saw him standing below, surrounded by glimmering walls, they thought it was some form of hidden technology. "You built this?" one of them asked in disbelief. Aaron nodded, not stopping his work. "It's not finished," he said. "I need to stabilize the airflow and add more vents." The insectoids exchanged glances, their mandibles twitching. "You're wasting energy," one of them said. "We dig holes to survive, not to build palaces." Aaron didn't respond. He simply pointed at the condensation dripping into a small pool beside him. The insectoid stared for a long moment, then left without another word. That night, Aaron finally allowed himself a few minutes of rest. He lay on the smooth rock, listening to the faint hum of air moving through the vents. The sound reminded him of ocean waves from his home on Earth, a soft rhythm, steady and alive. For the first time since arriving on Theron 4, he didn't feel the heat clawing at his lungs. He felt balance. The planet was no longer his enemy, but his partner in design. As dawn broke once more, the sun painted the dunes with golden fire, but inside the ridge, the air remained cool. Aaron sat up, wiping sand from his face, and whispered, "Now I know where to begin." Above him, the sky shimmered with unbearable brightness, yet deep beneath that merciless light, a human had found the first breath of comfort, and the desert, for all its fury, had started to yield. The seventh sunrise on Theron 4 arrived without mercy. The air shimmered like molten glass, and the dunes seemed to hum under the weight of heat. Most cadets no longer had the strength to move. The reptilian Varric had retreated deep into his pit, breathing shallowly through his scaled nostrils. The avian survivors pressed their wings against the sand, trying to trap whatever coolness remained below the surface. The insectoid's shells had dulled and cracked from dehydration. What had once been a field of ambition now looked like a graveyard scattered with the remnants of survival kits and tools half buried in the dust. Aaron Holt sat near the entrance of his underground chamber, staring at the horizon. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips split, but his mind pulsed with clarity. The condensation from the night before had collected in a small basin of polished rock, forming a fragile pool of liquid. His first tangible victory against the planet. He dipped his fingers into it and watched the droplets roll down his skin. They were cool, pure, and heavier than air. For the first time since landing, he allowed himself to drink slowly. The taste was faintly metallic, but it was the taste of survival. He stood and stretched, his muscles trembling from fatigue, and began preparing for the next stage. The underground chamber was stable but small, not enough to accommodate more than one person. The airflow was inconsistent, sometimes reversing direction when the wind above shifted. He needed to create a proper circulation system, a balanced exchange of hot and cool air. He climbed out of the pit, squinting against the glare, and began to scout the surrounding dunes. The light burned his eyes, but he pushed forward, measuring angles, marking wind direction with a strip of reflective foil. Each movement was calculated. He wasn't building a shelter anymore. He was building a living machine. By midday, he had found the right position for the second shaft, higher up the ridge, where the wind pressure was strongest. He used a makeshift drill powered by solar energy to bore through the hardened sand and rock. The process was slow, the tool overheating every few minutes, but he worked methodically. Every meter down brought a rush of warmer air rising toward the surface, proof that his plan would work. The heat that had once suffocated him would now power the system, drawing air through the cooling layers below. When he finally broke through into the main chamber, a gust of hot air escaped upward, followed by a deep sigh of cooler current flowing in. The two streams met in the passageway, swirling like invisible water. The noise was soft, rhythmic, alive. Aaron smiled faintly and wiped the dust from his face. The underground shelter was now breathing on its own. He climbed down into the chamber again, feeling the difference instantly. The air was cooler, lighter, almost fresh. His instruments confirmed a drop of nearly 20 degrees compared to the outside. He leaned against the smooth wall and exhaled. For a moment, he simply listened. The whisper of air moving through the vents, the faint drip of condensation hitting the basin, the steady heartbeat of a system that should not have existed in such a hostile world. He felt pride, not for the comfort it brought him, but for proving that the desert could be shaped by reason. As he examined the walls, he noticed the moisture collecting in uneven patterns. Certain sections were colder, while others remained dry. He realized he could control this. He began carving small grooves into the stone, guiding the condensation toward the basin. Then he lined the walls with mineral fragments that acted as natural wicks, helping the water flow evenly. Soon the walls glistened faintly in the dim light, transforming the chamber into something that looked almost alive. By dusk, the underground air had grown steady, the temperature constant. The upper shaft glowed faintly orange from the setting sun, while the lower vents exhaled thin wisps of cool vapor. Aaron sat at the center, cross-legged, breathing deeply. He had not realized until that moment how much tension had lived inside him, how the silence of the desert had seeped into his bones. Now, in the cool half-dark, he felt the planet's heartbeat slow to match his own. He was not alone for long. As the second night fell, faint footsteps echoed near the ridge. Aaron turned his head and saw a figure at the entrance. It was Varric, his scaly body glinting faintly under the moonlight. The reptilian hesitated, then descended partway into the chamber, blinking at the sudden coolness. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Aaron didn't answer at first. He handed him a metal cup half filled with the collected water. Varric stared at it suspiciously before taking a cautious sip. The reaction was immediate. His shoulders relaxed, his throat eased, and his eyes widened in disbelief. "You made airflow," he said softly, almost reverently. Aaron nodded. "The desert breathes now. You just have to listen." Word spread fast. By morning, a few other cadets had arrived, drawn by rumors of a place where the air was cold and the ground was wet. They approached cautiously, too proud to admit their desperation, but their bodies betrayed them. One avian collapsed at the entrance, gasping for air. Aaron helped her inside, guiding her toward the shade. The coolness revived her almost instantly. The others followed, hesitant, but unable to resist. Aaron didn't speak much. He showed them how to sit near the vents, where the air circulation was strongest, and how to breathe slowly to let their bodies adjust. The alien cadets murmured among themselves, their disbelief gradually turning into gratitude. None of them had imagined that such comfort could exist here. Some called it luck. Others called it human madness turned divine. But Aaron understood the truth. It was design born from observation. As the group rested, he continued working. He installed small stone columns to divide the airflow, preventing collapse. He expanded the condensation system by adding channels leading into shallow pools carved from the rock. Steam began to form when he placed heated stones from the surface near the vents, and the moisture condensed again on the walls, creating a cycle of vapor and cool droplets. The underground air filled with a gentle mist that glowed faintly in the low light, giving the impression of a living organism. When the others awoke from their brief rest, they found themselves surrounded by the impossible, a balance of heat and cold, dryness and moisture. One avian female dipped her hands into the pool and whispered that it felt like standing inside a dream. The reptilian Varric, once mocking, bowed his head slightly toward Aaron and said, "You've built comfort where none should exist." Aaron didn't answer. He only adjusted a vent, watching how the mist moved through the air. By nightfall, the wind outside roared across the dunes, sending dust storms spiraling into the sky. The cadets outside their holes were forced to abandon them and crawl toward the ridge. Aaron's chamber became a refuge. He didn't turn anyone away. Soon, the space filled with creatures from different worlds, avian, reptilian, insectoid, breathing the same cool air in silence. For the first time since the exam began, the camp was united by peace rather than fear. Aaron sat apart from them near the entrance. The wind outside howled, but down below, his creation hummed softly, the rhythm of air and steam steady and soothing. He looked at the faces of those around him, faces once filled with doubt and ridicule, now softened by relief, and felt something shift inside him. He hadn't built the chamber for himself anymore. It was no longer a survival tool. It had become a sanctuary for all of them. When midnight came, the air inside grew slightly warmer, the system balancing itself as the temperature outside plummeted. Aaron adjusted the vents and listened carefully to the sound of air moving through stone. It was no longer the chaotic rush of heat and dust. It was a calm pulse, steady and even. He lay back against the smooth wall and watched condensation drip into the pools like falling stars. As he drifted into a half-sleep, he realized something profound. The planet was not an enemy to be conquered, but a force to be harmonized with. Every gust of wind, every grain of sand, every shift in temperature had a rhythm that could be learned. The key to survival wasn't defiance, it was understanding. And with that thought, surrounded by the quiet hum of his creation and the faint breaths of those he had saved, Aaron finally slept, not from exhaustion, but from peace. When dawn rose again over Theron 4, the sky was a pale, blistered white, but beneath the dunes the air was soft and cool. The underground chamber no longer felt like a survival shelter. It had become something entirely different. The walls glistened with moisture, thin streams of condensation traced down to the shallow pools, and the air shimmered faintly with mist. Aaron Holt stood near the central basin, watching his reflection ripple across the surface. The air around him carried a faint mineral scent mixed with the warmth of steam from heated stones. What had started as a desperate experiment was now a living ecosystem hidden under a dead world. Above ground, the storm had left chaos. The once smooth dunes were torn by violent winds, half-buried shelters lay collapsed, and the horizon was littered with shards of equipment scattered by the gale. When the storm cleared, the surviving cadets emerged in silence, their bodies trembling, eyes squinting through dust. They no longer looked at the human with ridicule or suspicion. They looked at him as if he had reached into the heart of the planet and pulled out a miracle. Aaron didn't seek praise or acknowledgement. He was focused on refining the structure. The airflow worked, but he could sense that it was unbalanced. The lower vents were collecting too much heat during the midday hours, and the condensation cycle was uneven. He wanted perfection, not because the exam demanded it, but because the system itself deserved to function as elegantly as possible. Every adjustment he made felt less like survival engineering and more like creation, as though he were shaping a living organism's lungs and veins. He spent the morning carving new tunnels into the upper ridge, using a combination of tools and carefully directed heat. He embedded fragments of alien alloy into the walls to strengthen them and improve thermal transfer. The more he worked, the more he realized that the desert's materials were ideal for what he was building. The porous rock filtered air naturally, and the fine sand sealed cracks better than any synthetic sealant. It was as if the planet wanted this to exist, as if it had been waiting for someone to give it form. By midday, the chamber had grown larger, now divided into 3 sections. The first was the cooling hall, lined with reflective mineral veins that refracted light from the vents, bathing the space in soft hues of blue and silver. The second was the steam room, where heated stones vaporized the collected water, creating mist that circulated through the system and condensed again along the upper walls. The third was the resting alcove, a wide, low area carved from smooth stone where cadets could lie and breathe without fear of suffocation or sunburn. The alien cadets helped now, though Aaron hadn't asked. Varric, the reptilian who once mocked him, used his strong claws to carve out smooth ridges in the stone, creating channels for the steam. The avian female, whose feathers had grown thin from heat exposure, collected bioluminescent fungi from nearby caves and planted them in hollow recesses, giving the chamber a gentle light. Even the insectoid cadets, who communicated in short bursts of chittering sound, carried stones and built supports for the tunnels. For the first time, the survival exam felt like collaboration instead of competition. Aaron guided them with quiet precision. His voice remained calm even when exhaustion strained his body. When one of the avians complained that the steam was too heavy to breathe, he adjusted the vents until the flow evened out. When Varric accidentally cracked part of the wall, Aaron used fused sand and melted glass to seal it again. The others began to trust his instincts completely. What had started as a test of endurance had turned into an unspoken lesson in adaptation. As the sun sank behind the dunes, the underground structure reached its full form. The pools gleamed in the flickering light of the bioluminescent fungi. The steam shimmered softly in the air, and the faint hum of moving air filled the space with life. The cadets sat together, silent and awed. The desert above was merciless, but beneath it, they had built peace. One of the avians closed her eyes and whispered that the place reminded her of home. Another cadet, his body scaled and cold, pressed his hand into the pool and murmured that the water felt warmer than blood. Aaron listened without speaking. He watched as the mist curled upward through the vents, forming tiny clouds that drifted along the ceiling before disappearing into the air currents. The system was functioning perfectly now. Hot air rising, cool air sinking, moisture condensing, steam circulating. Everything was in balance. He had done more than survive. He had created harmony between life and the elements. Later that night, as the others slept peacefully on the stone floor, Aaron climbed up through the upper shaft and stepped into the open air. The stars above Theron 4 burned sharp and cold, unfiltered by atmosphere. The silence was absolute. The dunes stretched endlessly under the twin moons, silver light catching on every ridge. He stood there, breathing in the faint scent of dust and ozone, his body wrapped in cool air that leaked from the vents behind him. The desert that had once tried to kill him now exhaled through the structure he had built, alive and rhythmic. He looked toward the horizon where the faint glow of the Academy's orbital station shimmered against the night sky. Somewhere up there, the instructors were watching, recording data, and analyzing survival rates. He wondered what they saw when they looked at his site. Numbers? Temperature graphs? Or did they see what he saw? Proof that intelligence could turn death into life, isolation into community. He climbed back down before dawn and found Varric awake, sitting beside the basin. The reptilian turned toward him and said quietly, "You've done something no one else could. You changed the meaning of this exam." Aaron sat across from him, resting his arms on his knees. "No," he said softly. "The desert changed it. I just listened." The next morning, the air outside was still brutal, but it no longer mattered. The underground oasis had become self-sustaining. The walls were stable, the moisture cycle continuous, and the airflow kept temperatures steady. The cadets took turns collecting condensed water, rationing it evenly among themselves. They no longer spoke of surviving until extraction. They spoke of expanding the chamber, of what could be built next. The exam had turned into something greater, a shared dream of creating life where none should exist. When the orbital transport finally descended days later, the instructors were not prepared for what they saw. From above, the ridge appeared as a series of geometric vents arranged in symmetrical patterns. Heat readings showed abnormally cool zones, and energy sensors detected stable air pressure where no machinery existed. The command monitors filled with data that made no sense. When the doors of the transport opened, the first officer stepped into a rush of cool air rising from the sand. It carried with it the faint scent of moisture and the sound of distant dripping water. The cadets stood beside Aaron in silence as the officers entered the chamber. Their expressions shifted from disbelief to awe. The reports later described the place as an unassisted atmospheric stabilization system built from natural materials. The Academy had never seen anything like it, but the cadets didn't think in those terms anymore. To them, it was something much simpler, a home born from fire and perseverance. That evening, as the instructors questioned him about how he had designed it, Aaron gave them the same calm answer. "The desert told me what it needed. I just built what it asked for." The words confused them, but he didn't explain further. He knew the truth couldn't be measured in readings or schematics. It existed in the air's rhythm, in the sound of steam hissing softly through the vents, in the peace that settled deep within every person who entered that place. When night fell, the underground oasis glowed faintly beneath the dunes, its mist reflecting the pale starlight that filtered through the vents. The desert above still burned with fury during the day, but below, the world was cool, balanced, and alive. Aaron sat at the edge of the pool, his hands resting on the smooth stone, and listened to the breathing of his creation. It no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to the desert, to those who had suffered with him, and to every creature who would one day learn that survival was not about enduring pain, but about transforming it into harmony. When the transport ships departed and the instructors' voices faded into the high winds, silence once again claimed the desert. The extraction had been postponed for one final test, endurance through the transition of seasons. On Theron 4, that meant the end of the heat cycle and the arrival of the storm months, a time when the desert transformed from a furnace into a floodplain, where the skies would crack open and pour ice-cold rain for the first time in half a year. The cadets remained at the site, not as test subjects anymore, but as caretakers of what had been born beneath the sand. The underground oasis was no longer a shelter built for desperation. It was now a system capable of sustaining life. Aaron Holt spent the first few days studying the external air pressure changes. The dunes were shifting again, this time heavier, denser, darker in color. The sky grew pale gray instead of gold, and the horizon shimmered less. The unbearable glare was gone, replaced by a muted light that cast long shadows across the plain. For the first time since his arrival, he could walk above ground for hours without feeling his lungs burn. The other cadets joined him on the surface, their skin no longer scorched, their movements lighter, as if the planet had decided to grant them a truce. At dusk, he climbed to the highest ridge near the vents and looked back at what he had created. The openings were perfectly aligned, exhaling thin streams of mist that caught the fading sunlight and shimmered like silver ribbons. The desert looked alive, breathing softly through the system he had designed. The air that rose from below was humid and fragrant, carrying with it the quiet rhythm of life reclaimed from death. The others gathered near him, standing in silent admiration. None of them had imagined that a place like this could exist on such a cruel world. As the temperature continued to drop, the wind began to shift directions. Small storms rolled in from the western plateau, their edges dark and heavy with moisture. The first droplets of rain fell, hissing as they touched the still warm sand. The cadets ran to the open dunes, laughing and spreading their arms to feel the water strike their faces. Aaron stood apart, his expression thoughtful. He knew what the rain meant. It would soak into the porous sand and find its way into the chambers below. The structure had to withstand pressure and flooding. What had been a sanctuary of dry balance could drown in its own success if he didn't prepare. He returned underground and began reinforcing the lower walls. The air was cooler now, almost crisp. He directed Varric to seal several minor vents, rerouting airflow to the upper levels, and guided the avian cadets to construct gutters along the ceiling to channel incoming water into the central pool. The fungi lights reflected off the wet walls, giving the chamber an ethereal glow. Soon, drops began to fall through the vents, landing with a soft rhythm that echoed through the tunnels like the beat of a distant drum. The sound was hypnotic, steady, eternal. By the third night of rain, the transformation was complete. The underground air was no longer dry. It was filled with the scent of earth, minerals, and life. The pools deepened, and mist rose gently in the corridors. The desert above had turned to mud and clay, its golden dunes replaced by flowing streams of gray water that fed into the ground. The ecosystem Aaron had built absorbed it all, stabilizing itself as though it had been designed for this purpose from the beginning. The air circulation adjusted naturally to the new humidity, and the condensation system balanced itself, turning the chamber into a perfect equilibrium of water and air. Aaron watched it all unfold with quiet wonder. The structure had evolved beyond his calculations. It was no longer a system he controlled. It had become autonomous. Every sound, every shift of air, every droplet of water played a role in a natural symphony that he had merely conducted into existence. The cadets no longer spoke of the exam or the academy. They spoke of seasons, of growth, of how the desert would bloom when the storms passed. The word survival had lost its meaning. They had learned to live, not endure. When the final cycle of rain came, the sky darkened into a near-night hue. Lightning danced across the horizon, illuminating the world in flashes of white. The dunes shivered under the downpour, reshaping with every strike of wind. Aaron climbed to the surface once more, stepping into the storm. The air was cold, the rain stung his face, and the wind roared like a living beast. He closed his eyes and felt the rhythm of it, the pulse of a planet awakening after centuries of slumber. Behind him, the vents exhaled warm air from below, meeting the cold rain in clouds of vapor that twisted into spirals before vanishing into the storm. He stood there for a long time, drenched and motionless, as the sky broke open above him. The sound of thunder merged with the hum of his creation, and he felt a deep stillness within. The test had ended, but something far greater had begun. He realized that the exam was never about endurance or competition. It had always been about understanding, the balance between intelligence and instinct, control and surrender. The desert had not been a battlefield. It had been a teacher. When the storms finally passed, the world above was unrecognizable. The dunes were smooth again, sculpted into new shapes by wind and water. Small green shoots began to appear where moisture lingered, fragile but alive. The air was crisp and filled with a faint sweetness that none of the cadets had smelled before. Life had returned to a place long forgotten by it. The underground spa, no longer a mere shelter, was now a functioning biosphere. The pools glowed softly, steam rose in delicate ribbons, and the sound of dripping water echoed like a heartbeat through the stone. On the final day, as the extraction vessel descended once again from orbit, the cadets gathered at the entrance. The instructors stepped out, astonished to find the surface lush and cool, the air breathable, and the once hostile terrain transformed. Aaron stood at the center, calm and silent. When one of the instructors approached him, asking how he had achieved all this, he simply said, "We didn't fight the planet. We listened to it." The answer was written into his eyes, steady and certain, and no further explanation was needed. Before boarding the ship, he turned once more toward the ridge. The vents exhaled faint mist, glistening under the twin suns that had returned from behind the storm clouds. He knew that even after the cadets left, the system would continue to function, sustained by the natural rhythm of the planet. The oasis would outlive them all. It was no longer a human creation. It was part of Theron 4 itself. When the engines ignited and the transport began to rise, Aaron looked down through the viewport. The desert spread beneath him like a vast tapestry of gold and silver. From orbit, the oasis appeared as a constellation of shining vents, pulsing softly with heat and life. The instructors watched in silence as the sensors confirmed the impossible. A stable microclimate, self-sustaining, spreading slowly outward. What had begun as a human experiment in survival had become a blueprint for colonization, not through domination, but through coexistence. As the ship climbed higher, the desert shrank into a pale curve against the stars. Aaron closed his eyes and let the quiet hum of the engines blend with the memory of the underground chamber's breathing. He felt no triumph, no pride, only a deep peace that came from knowing he had understood something fundamental. Survival was not the art of resistance, but of harmony. The desert had shown him that even the harshest world could cradle life if one learned to listen to its silence. When Theron 4 disappeared into the distance, its twin suns gleaming like golden eyes in the void, Aaron finally smiled. The heat had ended, but its lesson would remain forever, carved not into stone, but into understanding.